Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. Today, Dr. Mallory Rahe will present about building rural wealth. Before I invite Mallory to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected today via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open the chat screen, just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined today by phone, then you can email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during the webinar today, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. Fourth, we will make a recording of today's presentation available. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access that recording sometime tomorrow. You can also find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our division's YouTube channel. So now we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Building Rural Wealth Through a Value Chain Approach. Presenting is Dr. Mallory Rahe, who is an Assistant Extension Professor of Agricultural and Applied Economics. So thank you, Mallory, for presenting today. If you could please unmute your microphone and start your video, then we can begin today's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to join today. I'm excited to share a little bit more about this work and the value that I think we can bring to Missouri. So, rural wealth creation is a framework for approaching regional economic development. And in general terms, it takes a systems approach. It broadly considers a wide range of assets as both inputs and outcomes of development. And it can be layered upon other entrepreneurial and business support programming. So here's just a selection of reports and books that have been published on this topic. Today I'm going to talk about WealthWorks here listed at the bottom. This is a formal program that was developed over 5 years with funding from the Ford Foundation in high poverty regions in the US. And I worked with this approach at Oregon State University Extension for 6 years to adapt it and implement it, and we were supporting 7 different value chains in the state of Oregon. So I'm going to talk a lot about wealth and capital and assets, and before we go any farther, I want to make sure everyone understands what I mean when I say that. So we want to take a broad approach to looking at the assets in a community. Intellectual wealth we think of as the degree of innovation and creativity among individuals, institutions, organizations, and sectors. Individual wealth are the skills, knowledge, mental and physical wellness, sometimes also called human capital. Of course, financial capital is important and included, but this approach is also prioritizing and looking to understand natural, built, political, social, and cultural wealth. And all of these things are things we use as resources when we're approaching development, but we also want to be intentional in thinking about how the choices we make are impacting all of these capitals at the same time as well. And that the real value of this framework is to see wealth broadly and think about impact broadly and manage assets in a community broadly. The other things that set this work apart are, so I just spoke about the first, building multiple forms of wealth for household and community benefit, but the next is to also prioritize local ownership and control of assets so that when we are building wealth in our communities, we can make sure that more of that wealth is remaining rooted in the region. And then the final intentional focus is an emphasis on improving livelihoods. So we want to think about utilizing and building the knowledge, talent, and skills of the entire community. And the more intentional we can be about who we're including and what opportunities we're creating and making sure those extend to small producers, small landowners, employees, we'll have a greater impact on alleviating poverty in our communities. So WealthWorks is very much an asset-based approach. It's rooted in local regions and communities. It's very context specific in that way, and it aims to build wealth broadly and equitably. These three goals are kind of the why you would want to use WealthWorks or a rural wealth creation framework. Within WealthWorks, the how it looks in practice is to engage businesses and stakeholders to develop the linkages between local assets and a market using a value chain. And a WealthWorks value chain is focused on the set of steps that it takes to get a product from its original form to the customer, and to do so in a very deliberate way that is responding to these shared values. So we're building value for the end consumer and the businesses and communities by expanding local ownership, improving equity, and creating new forms of wealth. So this shared set of goals and values is what really drives all the activity in this effort. It helps you determine what are the right types of market demand that will allow us to do this, who are our best partners in this effort, and how do we really pursue opportunities. Um, the coordinator role is a distinguishing feature of this work, because without this person or organization, these things won't just happen, right? And this is a really critical part. It takes real capacity to have this intentional focus, but without the intentional focus, you're not going to have as deliberate outcomes along these three goals. When we think about providing value and looking for the types of value to support, there's many ways that this happens in markets. Here are a few examples. So sometimes it's just about finding ways to increase access to higher value markets for small producers. And the important thing is that the coordination of this effort allows access to happen, and allows more businesses to benefit than they would have been on their own. Some other ways are to look for entrepreneurs and innovators who are trying to bring new products to market, especially if these are underutilized assets like byproducts or waste products, or finding a new use and a new differentiated product. But in general, this work is very driven by markets. So it's important to be cognizant and responsive to changes in consumer preferences, but intentional that those preferences align with our values and our goals, so that we're building both stronger businesses and stronger communities. This is not just, a 1, 2, 3 and you're done. It's a very iterative process, and it has to be responsive and react to changes in the larger socioeconomic system. So for example, we talk about changes in consumer preferences, and I'm sure some of you have been reading the same stuff I have about everyone's speculating. Consumer preferences have changed so much during COVID. Which preferences are likely to stay and which ones will revert back? And what new market opportunities are there today, and how do we pursue those in a way and keep those opportunities there after people might be more inclined to revert back to some of their earlier practices and habits? So it's a systems thinking that takes time. There is a learning curve. It's very important that this is community-led and entrepreneur-focused. If businesses aren't at the table, the work won't work. And as I've learned, you have to really balance that short-term view with long-term. If you want to have broad, deep change in a socioeconomic system, that takes time. But in order to keep people engaged, you need to find ways of showing value and demonstrating the value of that engagement. Partnerships are really key to this work. Each value chain is different, and it involved different agencies and organizations on the ground in the community. So I've spoken a little bit about engaging businesses, but let me go back to this. There are many ways that businesses are at the heart of this approach. I think that's important for us to just remember as we look to implementing this in Missouri. It's dependent on business engagement. We need businesses to really help us understand from their own perspective, where are their new sector and market opportunities that create the best opportunities for wealth building. Then we want to go out and learn more about that using other sources of information, doing other data collection and value chain mapping. Again, this is a partnership with local businesses and bringing in additional resources to the table. When we're looking at prioritizing areas of focus, businesses are going to be they're going to have important insights about which challenges and opportunities have the best potential. And then when we're trying to actually implement change, the businesses are often the best to kind of weigh in, look at the additional information that's been brought to the table, and have those conversations about what are the priorities and what do they think is most likely to work, because this really is driven by businesses. And the trick to sort of keeping businesses engaged is to always understand these three different layers of interest. So self-interest, what's in it for me, needs to drive engagement so that businesses are enthusiastic and not just reluctant to be there, which means you have to be really cognizant of each business's needs and priorities, and then begin to understand how those relate to the needs and priorities of other businesses in the region. That's where you get to a place of shared interest, where suddenly businesses see the value in collaborating with one another. And then to truly implement system-wide change, you get to the place of common interest, where suddenly lots of businesses within this value chain in this region see the big goal that everybody wants. They see that there is value in working together. It's worth their time and effort and energy because they can accomplish more together. So, oops, sorry. Here's just one example of what this looks like. This comes from our work in a small port on the northern Oregon coast. And this group set out two shared goals and values. The first was to increase incomes for small boat fishing businesses, and the second was to improve livelihood opportunities for crew members and put them in a position to take over boats or start to own their own boats and expand the fleet. So we started by just basically understanding what are the steps that it takes to get a fish out of the ocean to a customer, and then understanding what are some of those primary components, and then assigning specific businesses within the region to those, which businesses were already doing those functions. And rules and regulations and supporting tasks were also really important, because it's not, these businesses don't operate in a vacuum. There's a lot of heavy regulation of the fishing industry and a lot of tasks that the fishermen need to support their work. So after the group created a map of the value chain, they could really understand where are their gaps and opportunities. And this is, again, when you think about the importance of business engagement, to really get to this point, businesses need to be willing to talk about their pain points openly with other businesses, so that you can start to identify opportunities to support not just one business, but many businesses. So through this process, the group found many different gaps and opportunities, and they ultimately chose to focus on expanding access to high-value products, and identified an entrepreneur who already had an idea of something that would benefit his business and many other businesses. They just weren't really sure if it was the right time, if they had the right resources, if this was going to work. And we found this in all of our value chains. This effort is not about, kind of dropping ideas down on businesses. It led us to people who were already thinking in this way, and the real value of the approach was to bring additional resources and support to help entrepreneurs make these decisions and move forward quicker, faster, with confidence, with better information. And in doing so, we were able to support lots of businesses in a region. So that was a quick example, and just to kind of to recap, when this work works, you start by developing stronger relationships with businesses in order to identify shared interests that can become opportunities to support entrepreneurs in a way that brings system change. And so the decisions of one business unlock new market opportunities and more wealth for lots of businesses in a region. Our work in Oregon was a little unique for an extension. We partnered with a nonprofit, and we had a lot of funders, so we were able to not just offer educational and training opportunities, but to make 7 direct business investments. And then we followed those businesses for 2 years to document the change within the system. And so I recently published a paper with a co-author this spring that kind of reflected on that evaluation and what we learned from these investments. And so broadly, just to kind of summarize a few things, we found that it was really important to support businesses that were already buying from other businesses, because that meant that helping that business grow immediately helped a bunch of other businesses as well. And if you were able to support an innovation that really did allow immediate growth, that had a bigger impact in wealth creation in the short term. But it's also important to think about the scalability of an investment. And sometimes our investments, they produced one growth, but there wasn't really anywhere else. The next growth step was going to require significant resources, replicating a business model in another business. And so the scalability was limited, and therefore the overall wealth creation was limited as well. As a market-driven approach, it's important to think about those market opportunities you're pursuing. And we were supporting businesses that were pursuing a range of markets, from the highly developed market that had its own set of challenges to access, to people who were really going after brand new markets that there wasn't a lot of competition, but the market wasn't well developed. And so that needed a very different set of resources and intentionality to help develop that market. And finally, we did this work in 7 different areas across the state of Oregon. And it's important that anytime you work in rural areas to be very cognizant of the limits of distance to markets, density of that market that you can most easily access, and sort of the strength and quality of the local labor force. And I don't mean to discourage us from working in places that have smaller markets and smaller populations, but we do a disservice to ourselves and our communities when we don't recognize that work in these places inherently takes more resources. It will go slower. There are more internal challenges to surmount, and especially when we think about capacity for supporting this work. There's fewer people, so there's less chance that the local region can just carry this work. You know, that they need more support. So since I moved to Missouri, I'm happy to say that I'm able to support one ongoing effort to bring this work here. So the Kansas City Food Hub, in collaboration with West Central Missouri Community Action Agency and the New Growth Partnership, received federal funds to hire a value chain coordinator and a supply chain coordinator to bring this emphasis to the Kansas City Food Hub and think about how do we strategically allow more producers access to unmet market demanded Kansas City. And this project began this year, and what we found so far is that having additional capacity has been really critical to this value chain effort, because the Kansas City Food Hub lost their established markets. They were selling a lot to institutional cafeterias that closed and have not reopened. So it was important for that system to have additional capacity to start identifying where's our customer now, how do we get to that customer. And we're hoping that as we, transition into next year's growing season, we can start stepping back and doing more systems thinking and looking at, it's very difficult to match supply and demand in a regional food system. And our project is building on not only previous WealthWorks projects, but other efforts that have used value chain coordination, not always with a WealthWorks idea, in order to facilitate this matching. One other thing I'm really excited about in our state is that we have new resources to support producers through the Missouri Small Business Development Center for Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. This is a new statewide center. It draws upon agriculture and extension expertise across our state, as you can see on the map here. We're collaborating with the network of existing small business development centers, and we're really able to provide new resources to producers to think about value chain opportunities, to look at market, maybe as a statewide center that is able to find ways to collaborate, we can look for identifying shared interest and begin to make some more linkages within these value chains. Although I'll say that to really do value chain coordination right, you need significant resources. And the SBDC will be a part of that, but can't be all of it. If you want to learn more, there is a lot available. Here are two resources that I've created. There's a guideline, an extension guideline for how to work with small businesses and engage them in this process. And then there's also 4 videos designed for practitioners that walk them through these concepts. And the videos are hosted on the National WealthWorks website that's run by the Aspen Institute. And NATO also recently put out some more case studies, one of which is also from Oregon. So with that, I welcome your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory, for your great presentation. If you have a question for Mallory, please go ahead and submit that in the chat screen, or I can also take those via email at roacham@missouri.edu. Mallory, to kickstart our discussion, you stressed how the value chain coordinator has a really important role in ensuring that community wealth building goals are met. What type of expertise, and is it a person or is it an organization, should that value chain coordinator have?
It's a really good question. And there's been work that has evaluated that and papers published on this. So I'm happy to talk about this at length. But I'll say that it's important for that person to have familiarity with the sector at hand, to be comfortable talking to businesses and able to think in a systems framework. And so what we found in Oregon is that we were often collaborating with the local economic development group and supporting them with extension expertise, and that over the life cycle of one of these projects, a group may change its focus. It may start in one sector and then realize there's not enough local businesses that are actually interested. So this is a non-starter. It may be a great opportunity, but we don't have businesses in our region. We need to pivot. And in those cases, we also had to transition who the coordinating entity was, or to share responsibilities between a couple of different entities.
Great, thank you for that. In your example, the seafood example, you showed how you had some examples of economic wealth creation, but were there other impacts noted within the other wealth creation segments, like social, built, cultural, capital?
Absolutely. I didn't go over that because I didn't have enough time. I had too much I wanted to say, but we documented how all 8 forms of wealth changed in our value chains. And sometimes there was no change, but there were a lot of really important social and cultural changes. When we think about the seafood example, one of the biggest things that was surprising, we didn't expect this, is that by creating more opportunities at the local port for fishermen, they spent more nights at home. They didn't have to go out looking for markets up and down the coast. They knew they could reliably come back to their home port. There were more buyers that came to the port as a result of the value chain work. They got better prices, and they knew they could rely on that. So spending less time at sea meant they were spending more time at home, and they all talked about how important that was. And it also helped strengthen that social relationships between them, because as Bill talks about in his comment in the chat, a culture of cooperation is important. Business owners, it's competitive, right? And we don't want to, of course, competition is very, very important, but this work tries to help businesses understand that things that are in your own self-interest can also be in the self-interest of other businesses, and that by working together on pieces of this work, you can compete in the market, but you're both going to be better positioned to do that by working together. So some business owners are not interested in having those conversations, and that's okay, because this has to be business led, and there are other opportunities and ways that they can look to support their business. But when we think about a collaborative, intentional approach that has resources and funding, we want to look for those businesses that are willing to think more broadly than their own self-interest.
Sure, thanks for that. How can producers get in contact with the resources that are now available through the Missouri Food, Ag, and Forestry Small Business Development Center?
You can reach out and contact me, or I can grab a link and throw it in the chat to sign up for services directly. We have a range of counselors across the state. We have new businesses signing up nearly every day, and we're more than happy to work with people and have initial conversations.
Great, thank you. You stressed how the opportunities for rural wealth creation depend highly on markets and market opportunities. So in your work that you did in Oregon, were resources provided to help small businesses discover market opportunities, or would the market opportunity assessment stage really depend on what the business was discovering on its own?
No, we provided resources for market demand studies and feasibility studies, and we also helped regions go out and secure additional resources to do those studies and work, because that's very important, and that can be resource intensive. One opportunity that I think is exciting about Missouri is that we have a lot of funded feasibility studies, and agriculture is so important in this state, and I do see a lot of resources and intentionality around agriculture and developing value added opportunities in this state that wasn't present in the same way in Oregon. So I'm very excited about how we can start to leverage the work that's already coming out of the Food and Beverage Initiative and other feasibility studies and start to think about implementation. So we have new knowledge about markets and businesses. Now we need someone who has the ability to sit down and start pulling all these pieces together. And that coordination effort is critical, but it's also very difficult in that it's resource intensive.
Right. A question here is asking, what recommendations do you give us to deal with those actors who don't trust us in working collectively?
So some people, in general, so I've done this work in both Oregon and Idaho, held workshops, talked about the concepts. People overwhelmingly are interested. A lot of this stuff is intuitive. It makes sense. A lot of it is not new. It's pulling together ideas and concepts that already exist in a more fragmented way. So we've found there's been great uptake in these ideas already, and but when you find a business owner who's not ready, I think what our approach was to just continue to work with those businesses that were engaged and were interested. And when you're in a rural region, word gets around. You can be intentional about the way you communicate about the work, and that's why it's important to look for small wins along the way to demonstrate the value. This is not just another group holding meetings like, here are some things we're learning, here's new information we've gained, like, here's something small that we've done, in order to keep that door open, but ultimately, it has to be up to that business owner to decide. But in our case, communicating the success along the way, and then continuing to just reach out and have friendly conversations or attempt to, often went a long way.
Great. Well, we have time for one last question, Mallory. Economic development can be a slow process that involves multiple stakeholders and will experience multiple challenges along the way. So what can communities following a rural wealth creation model do to stay focused on their ultimate goal despite the potential for experiencing setbacks along the way?
A lot of things. So it's hard to give just a single answer. But I, I don't think I can stress enough the importance of how context dependent this is. And it looks very different in every community that it occurs, but it's happening across the country. And there are lots of people in this broad network who are very willing to share their experiences. They've already shared their experiences in various reports and videos and websites. And I think that each community that might pursue something like this shouldn't try to do it alone, but to reach out and learn from the experience of others, and have that support network.
Great, Mallory. Well, thanks for sharing today's presentation, and thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you would please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via your email within about a day from now. You can join us for our next Engaging for Missouri webinar on Wednesday, October 14th. At that time, James Kaufman, who is a project director at MU's Economics and Management of Agrobiotechnology Center, and he will share a presentation titled Biogas Production Prospects for Missouri. So again, thank you for joining us and enjoy your Wednesday. Thanks, Mallory.